What's going on, everyone? Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to another tech tip. Today we're talking about sway bars and noises related to sway bars. So behind me on the lift we have two wildly different cars. One is a BMW E46 M3, the other one's a Volvo XC90. Both these cars have sway bars. In fact, most cars have sway bars. Very few you would find would not have sway bars. When it comes to suspension noises, sway bars are a common overlooked item, both in terms of replacement as well as a source of suspension noise. Most people will automatically assume ball joints, control arms, bushings, struts, springs, etc. as being a source of noise in the suspension. Sway bars are often overlooked as a possible source of that. Both these cars have two totally different failures, but both of them have a similar failure in regards to the sway bar mounts. We're going to show you those differences. We're going to talk about why they vary in terms of how they have to be fixed. But either way, these are both two really interesting cases of things that have failed in regards to the sway bar and the noises that are coming from these cars due to that. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the BMW M3 first. We'll show you what's going on with that, and then we'll switch over to the XC90 and show you what's going on that end as well. So we're just taking the car for a spin right now, and I can hear a knocking noise. I think that's from the sway bar. But in this car's particular case, the sway bar at the mounting points has rotted over time. So water's gotten in there. The paint or the powder coating, whatever BMW used on the sway bars in the factory, has basically wiped away, and then moisture's gotten between the sway bar and the bushing itself. And when we measure the diameter of the sway bar itself, where it sits within the bushing, it is significantly smaller than what it's supposed to be. So there's a gap there. And particularly when entering a driveway at a steep angle or something like that, that's when you're probably going to hear the sway bar knock around a little bit, just strictly because of that gap. When you're driving down the road, you won't hear it as much, but it's definitely more of an annoyance, and also the sway bar is going to work less effectively because of that play. So we have the E46 M3 here up on the lift, up in the air. What we need to do is remove the splash shield first. That'll gain us access to the front sway bars. At least on the E46, the front sway bars sit on the frame rail, so they are easily accessible depending on the car. Some sway bars go over the top of the subframe, which is awful. But in this case, we'll be able to show you what's going on with this car, in which the sway bar has actually rotted away underneath the rubber mounts. So a couple 8mm screws take that splash shield off, a couple 13mm nuts to lower the sway bar down, and we'll take a look to see how much this sway bar has rotted away over time. So at least on this E46 M3, we do have two very extreme examples of two different cars that have sway bar related issues. Both these cars do have sway bar bushing related problems. However, on the E46 M3, in many cars, the sway bar bushing itself could be replaced. So if the sway bar bushing is worn, you could replace it. However, on a lot of cars, or a lot of other cars, and even some newer cars, the sway bar bushing could be bonded to the sway bar itself, which means it can't be replaced independently, and you have to replace the entire sway bar. In this case, I think it's pretty evident what we have going on here. You can see that the paint is peeling away, or the coating on the sway bar is peeling away from the sway bar itself. And I'll just pull this bracket off. The diameter of this sway bar is supposed to be 26mm. And I don't think that is 26mm anymore where the sway bar has been. So there is quite a large gap. We'll go ahead and measure it. See where we are. We have a nice 25mm in the middle of it, as opposed to the outside where we're at 26mm. So 1mm of material has rotted away from the sway bar where the bushing is. So chances are what happened here is the paint wore off over time. This is a 20-year-old car, and it has almost 190,000 miles on it. So the paint has worn off, and then moisture has gotten in there, which has rotted away further. And then also the sway bar has to pivot on the bushing itself, so over time that could have whittled it down a little bit as well. So we got the 25mm on this side. Let's take a look at our right side. And that looks actually even worse. So again, 26 millimeters is the diameter this sway bar is supposed to be. And on this side, we're down to 24.5. Again, we come to the outside, 26 millimeter. Right where the bushing rides, we are short about 1.5 millimeters in diameter. So the sway bar is not going to be nearly as effective because its mounting points are gone. And when the sway bar is being loaded up, that sway bar is going to be moving around a lot more, so it's not going to work as effectively. And with that much material missing, it's definitely going to make some noise when it's loaded up, particularly if you're entering a driveway and the one side of the suspension is loaded. There's going to be a lot of slop up and down vertically in the sway bar that shouldn't be there. And in this case, there is no fix for this outside of replacing the sway bar. So this is a very extreme example of sway bar wear. If you're not looking for this specific problem, or you're not aware of the problem, or you don't see any evidence on the sway bar itself, you might be looking at the sway bar links. You could be looking at the control arm ball joints, tie rod ball joints, control arm bushings, struts, strut mounts. I mean, you can go crazy trying to find this noise. But when you see something like this, it's usually not great. And also, when you have this type of wear itself, if you're looking at the rubber bushing, you'll typically see brownish, reddish dust on the outside of the bushing, which is exactly what we have on this, which is an indication of wear. Anytime you see that brownish, reddish dust on anything that's moving, you could be almost 100% sure something is not happy there. So in this case, we will have a DIY on replacing the front sway bar on this car, and also the rear sway bar, just for good measure. But yeah, this is something that on a 20-year-old car you might need to replace. So with that said, we've shown you this example. Let's go show you the Volvo, and we'll kind of show you what that sway bar bushing looks like and where the noise is on that car as well. Okay, so now we're moving on to the XC90 and what's happening with this car. So the complaint is handling does not feel that great. Front end feels sort of disconnected, which is going to be very relevant in a second here. And also there is some clanking and other weird noises that are coming from the front. Also sort of self-explanatory, but there's really two things that are happening in this front suspension related to the sway bar. So with that said, let's go take a look. I think you'll be pretty surprised by what you see here. Sway bar link has broken in half at some point, and you can see that it's bent. So something must have hit it and caused it to have some sort of fatigue failure. But that is not normal, and also that's a smoking gun immediately. So no surprise there why the front end feels a little bit loose. So effectively the sway bar is no longer doing anything. In order for the sway bar to work, it needs to be connected to the suspension on the left and right side. So in this case, the sway bar link needs to be replaced. That's a fairly easy fix. Another thing to mention is sway bar links themselves can make noise if they're even still in good condition. Any kind of play within the ball joints, particularly these style that have the plastic caps on them, they do wear out. Any kind of play in the sway bar links, you'll typically hear clicks when you go over bumps. Surprisingly, these ball joints still feel really good. Something happened there, whatever that is. And then the other thing, this is really specific to sway bars that have bonded sway bar bushings. The other thing we noticed looking at this is the sway bar mounts, which sit on top of the subframe. They're in very rough shape. It honestly looks like the rubber is being pushed out of the bracket. But basically in this case, even if we were to simply replace the sway bar link, which would restore some performance to the front suspension, the other issue here is these sway bar bushings are in such rough shape that you're still going to get noise from the front, very similar to how the M3 is. So the downside here is this is multiple things that need to be replaced, but the positive is these are pretty easy to find situations with the front sway bar, or any sway bar for that matter, where when you look at it, you'll know immediately, well, that's broken, so that needs to be repaired. And then taking a look at the mounts, which are always a source of potential noise, if you see anything that looks like that, you know that's another thing you have to address. But at least on this car, the first fix is replace the sway bar link so the car drives and handles relatively normal. And then later on, we will have a DIY on how to replace a sway bar on an XC90, because that is a pretty involved job. The subframe has to be lowered, etc. So we're not going to be doing that today, but rather just wanted to show you another example of a worn sway bar mount and the effect that that would have in terms of noise on the suspension. So there you go. 2 really interesting examples of sway bar related problems that clearly make suspension noise. The M3 was a little bit more subtle. You'd have to really look at those sway bar mounts and see how much corrosion there was, and also to see that much material just having whittled away over 20 years plus the corrosion. Unless you were specifically looking for that, you probably wouldn't have noticed. The XC90, on the other hand, a little bit more obvious. The broken sway bar link is always a dead giveaway, plus the really loose feeling front suspension with it being disconnected. That's because the sway bar isn't doing anything anymore, so that's kind of an easy one to see. But the one that's a little bit less obvious is how worn those sway bar bushings are. Again, you have to know to look for that, and really worn sway bar mounts like that are always going to cause some kind of noise, and it's also going to reduce the effectiveness of the sway bar. So if you have a vehicle that's making front suspension noise or rear suspension noise, definitely take a look at the sway bars as a possible source, especially if nothing has been touched on them. Typically, these are overlooked on a lot of cars. They're not serviced. They're not even really paid much attention to. And so over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, however old the vehicle is, those parts could wear out and start to cause problems. So with that said, I hope you learned something in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. If you like this video, hit the like button, and of course, hit subscribe. We always have a lot of content on the way, and we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.